My family used my college fund to pay for my cousin's wedding. You can always take out loans, they shrugged. 7 years later, they needed my help, and I gave them the same answer. I, 23 never thought my own family would choose a wedding over my future, but that's exactly what happened during my senior year of high school. The college fund my parents had been building since I was born, 18 years of careful saving, vanished overnight to pay for my cousin's extravagant wedding. My parents sat me down in our kitchen that spring evening, their faces carrying that expression I'd learned to dread. Mom fidgeted with her coffee cup while Dad cleared his throat repeatedly. They explained that my cousin desperately needed financial help for her dream wedding, and since I was smart enough to get scholarships anyway, they decided to redirect my college fund to her. When I asked about the remaining costs, Dad waved his hand dismissively and told me I could always take out student loans. Mom nodded along, adding that family comes first and I'd understand when I was older. They made it sound like I was being selfish for even questioning their decision. The fund contained $43,000, not enough for a full ride anywhere decent, but enough to cover most of my expenses at the state university I'd planned to attend. Instead, I watched that money transform into overpriced flowers, a designer dress, and an open bar for 300 guests. I spent that summer working double shifts at a local restaurant, desperately trying to save enough for my first semester. My guidance counselor helped me apply for every scholarship and grant available, but it wasn't enough. I ended up taking out substantial loans and choosing a cheaper community college for my first 2 years. Those community college years were brutal. I worked 40 hours a week while carrying a full course load, sleeping 4 hours a night, and surviving on ramen and whatever free food I could find on campus. My parents occasionally asked how school was going, but they never offered to help with expenses. Meanwhile, my cousin posted endless photos from her honeymoon in Europe and frequent date nights at expensive restaurants. After community college, I transferred to a state university and somehow managed to graduate with a degree in computer science. The debt was crushing, over $60,000, but I'd done it entirely on my own. I found a decent job at a tech company and moved 3 hours away, determined to build the life my family had made so much harder to achieve. For the next few years, I kept minimal contact with my parents. I attended obligatory holidays and family gatherings, but the relationship felt hollow. They never acknowledged what they'd done or apologized for essentially stealing my future. When relatives asked about my success, my parents would beam proudly and take credit for raising such an independent son. My cousin's marriage lasted exactly 3 years. The divorce was messy and expensive, with both sides hiring aggressive attorneys. She moved back in with her parents and worked part-time at a retail store, barely making ends meet. The fairy tale wedding they'd sacrificed my education for had crumbled into bitter court battles and divided assets. 7 years after graduation, I'd managed to pay off most of my student loans and had built a comfortable life. I owned a small condo, drove a reliable car, and had even started contributing to my own retirement fund. My parents, however, were facing their own financial crisis. Dad's small business had been struggling for months, and Mom's part-time job wasn't covering their expenses. They dipped into their retirement savings and were now facing the possibility of losing their house. The medical bills from Dad's recent heart surgery had drained what little they had left. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening. Mom's voice was strained as she explained their situation, dancing around what she really wanted to ask. Finally, Dad took the phone and directly requested a loan of $30,000 to help them avoid foreclosure. He promised they'd pay me back as soon as the business recovered. I listened quietly as he outlined their plan, their timeline, their absolute desperation. When he finished, I asked if they remembered my college fund. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Dad cleared his throat and said that was ancient history, and they needed help now. I reminded them of their exact words from 7 years ago, that I could always take out loans, that I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. I suggested they follow their own advice and apply for a loan from the bank. Dad's voice grew sharp as he accused me of being petty and holding grudges. Mom got back on the phone, crying as she begged me to reconsider. She said family should help family, that they'd always been there for me. I almost laughed at the irony. I asked her where that philosophy had been when I was eating 1 meal a day to afford textbooks. The conversation ended badly, with Dad calling me ungrateful and Mom sobbing about losing their home. I hung up feeling a mixture of guilt and vindication. Part of me wanted to help them, but the larger part remembered those years of struggle they could have prevented. Update 1. My decision sparked a family war that I hadn't anticipated. Within days, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd heard about the situation. Most of them lectured me about family loyalty and Christian forgiveness, conveniently ignoring how my parents had treated me. My cousin, the same one whose wedding had consumed my college fund, called me personally. She had the audacity to remind me how much that wedding had meant to everyone and suggested that maybe it was time I stopped being bitter about ancient history. When I pointed out that her marriage had lasted exactly as long as my college years, she hung up on me. The guilt-tripping intensified when my uncle called to explain that my parents were good people who'd made one mistake. He offered to mediate a family meeting where we could work everything out. I declined, knowing that any such meeting would involve 12 people telling me why I should hand over my money. Meanwhile, my parents were exploring other options. They'd applied for several loans, but kept getting denied due to Dad's poor credit and inconsistent business income. Mom had started working extra shifts at her retail job, but it wasn't nearly enough to make up the shortfall. 3 weeks after our initial conversation, Dad suffered another minor heart episode that landed him in the hospital overnight. Mom called to update me, her voice heavy with exhaustion and barely contained panic. She didn't directly ask for money again, but the implication was clear. The stress was literally killing him. I drove up to visit Dad in the hospital, not because I'd changed my mind about the money, but because I'm not completely heartless. He looked older and frilier than I'd ever seen him, connected to monitors and wearing a hospital gown that made him appear vulnerable. We talked for about an hour, mostly about neutral topics like work and the weather. Finally, he brought up the money again, his voice weaker but still carrying that familiar edge of entitlement. He said he couldn't understand how his own son could watch his parents lose everything when he had the means to help. I asked him if he remembered how it felt to watch his son struggle through college, working multiple jobs and accumulating crushing debt. Dad's face hardened as he insisted that had been different. I was young and capable of handling challenges. Now they were old and running out of options. The conversation revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. My parents genuinely didn't see what they'd done as wrong. In their minds, redirecting my college fund to my cousin's wedding had been a reasonable family decision. They viewed my current refusal to help as vindictive and disproportionate. Update 2. 2 months later, my parents lost their house. The foreclosure proceedings moved faster than anyone expected, and they were forced to move in with my uncle temporarily. Dad's business officially closed, leaving him unemployed at 62 with significant health issues. The family pressure reached unprecedented levels. My grandmother called to tell me I was breaking her heart by refusing to help my parents. Various cousins accused me of having more money than compassion. Even family friends reached out to express their disappointment in how I was handling the situation. But something interesting happened during this period. I started hearing different versions of the story from various family members. My aunt mentioned that my parents had actually taken money from 2 different college funds, mine and my younger brother's, to pay for that wedding. My brother had been only 10 at the time, so the theft of his fund wouldn't become apparent for several more years. Another cousin revealed that the wedding hadn't cost $43,000. It had cost nearly $70,000. My parents had contributed additional money from their own savings and had borrowed against their house to cover the rest. The financial decisions around that wedding had been far more reckless than I'd realized. Most shocking was learning that my cousin and her ex-husband had actually offered to pay my parents back after their divorce, but my parents had declined, saying it was a gift. They'd had an opportunity to recover some of the money and chose not to take it, yet now expected me to bail them out of the consequences. Armed with this new information, I felt even more justified in my decision. My parents hadn't just made one mistake. They'd made a series of increasingly poor financial choices, all while maintaining that I was responsible for fixing the mess they'd created. Dad found a part-time job at a hardware store, making barely above minimum wage. Mom increased her hours again, but their combined income wasn't enough to afford rent on even a modest apartment. They remained dependent on my uncle's charity, sleeping in his guest room and sharing a bathroom with his teenage children. The living situation was clearly stressing everyone involved. My uncle's wife started making pointed comments about how some people needed to swallow their pride and accept help when it was offered. The implication was obvious. I should give my parents money so they could move out of her house. Update 3. A year after losing their house, my parents' situation had stabilized somewhat. They'd found a small rental apartment and were managing to cover basic expenses, though they had no savings and were living paycheck to paycheck. Dad's health had improved slightly, and Mom seemed less stressed now that they weren't facing immediate homelessness. The family dynamics, however, had permanently shifted. Holiday gatherings became tense affairs where people chose sides and conversations died whenever I entered the room. Some relatives openly blamed me for my parents' ongoing struggles, while others quietly admitted they understood my position. My younger brother, now in high school, had learned about his stolen college fund and was furious. He confronted our parents directly, demanding to know how they planned to pay for his education. Their response was predictably disappointing. They suggested he'd be smart enough to earn scholarships and could always take out loans if needed. This revelation sparked a broader family reckoning. Other relatives started questioning financial decisions they'd previously accepted without thought. My aunt demanded to know why her daughter's wedding had been worth destroying 2 children's educational futures. My uncle began asking harder questions about the family's financial priorities. My cousin, meanwhile, had started dating someone new and was already talking about another wedding. When she casually mentioned expecting family help with expenses again, the conversation came to an abrupt halt. Several relatives made it clear that the previous wedding had cost too much in too many ways. I remained firm in my decision not to help my parents financially. However, I did start visiting them more regularly and helped in other ways, driving Dad to medical appointments, helping Mom with technology issues, and generally trying to rebuild some semblance of a relationship. During one of these visits, Dad finally acknowledged that taking my college fund had been wrong. He didn't exactly apologize, but he admitted they'd made mistakes and said he understood why I was angry. It wasn't the full accountability I'd hoped for, but it was more than I'd expected to receive. Mom took longer to come around, but eventually admitted that watching me struggle through college had been harder than she'd let herself acknowledge at the time. She said they'd convinced themselves I was strong enough to handle anything, but now realized they'd been protecting themselves from guilt rather than thinking about my best interests. These partial acknowledgments didn't change my financial decision, but they did help heal some of the emotional wounds. I began to see my parents as flawed humans who'd made terrible choices, rather than villains who'd deliberately sabotaged my future. The final resolution came when my brother received a full scholarship to a prestigious university. His academic achievements were partly motivated by knowing he couldn't count on family financial support, and he'd worked incredibly hard to secure his own future. At his graduation party, Dad made a speech about how proud he was of his son's independence and work ethic. I caught Dad's eye during that speech and saw something that might have been recognition, an understanding that his children's success had come despite, not because of, his financial decisions. We didn't discuss it directly, but something shifted in our relationship from that moment forward. Looking back, I don't regret refusing to give my parents money. The lesson they'd taught me, that I needed to be financially independent and couldn't count on family support, had served me well. By applying that same lesson to their situation, I'd forced them to confront the consequences of their choices. The family has never fully healed from this conflict, but it has evolved. We're more honest about money, more careful about financial decisions, and more aware of how our choices affect others. My parents learned to live within their means, my brother secured his own future, and I maintained my principles while rebuilding damaged relationships. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is refuse to enable their poor decisions. 7 years later, I gave them exactly what they'd given me, the opportunity to figure it out on their own.